My passion, as you know, is to share sacred knowledge. And one of my most favorite books of all time was called The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. And he has this amazing chapter in here on the Vitruvian Man. You can see here, this is Masonic knowledge, but this drawing was, Vitruvius was a Roman architect 2,000 years ago at the time of Jesus. And this was the drawing that inspired Leonardo da Vinci to create his Vitruvian Man. So we're going to be looking at this, the Vitruvian Man, and I've drawn this on the board to give you an overview and an explanation. The question is, why is that circle also touching the square? Why isn't it lower down? So we're going to examine the mathematics of this. But first of all, the next book, over 40 years ago, I discovered this book by John Michell in the City of Revelation. And he inspired me in my early 20s to recognize that inside the mystical squaring of the circle, or the rectification of the square, we can see that there's a pyramid angle between the square and the circle and the mathematics of the moon, earth dimension. So he was the first one that I know of. Perhaps even there may have been earlier scholars who discovered the pyramid maths inside the rectification of the square. So this is ancient knowledge. I believe that knowledge from Jean Michel was actually discovered by Vitruvius. So Vitruvius was Herodotus went to the pyramids in 400 BC, just before Pythagoras. So this drawing comes back way back in time. It's antiquity. Okay, so the other thing I'd like to show you is that Jean Michel, they put together his latest work on sacred geometry, How the World is Made. And this is a modern one done in just 2017. And you can see that there's more reference here to the mathematics of the pyramid. So when you see this diagram here, it's not equal areas, it's called equal perimeters. So the square is equal to the circle going around it. And that's called the rectification of the square. So let's look at the square. So I'm going to draw that in yellow here. So this square, we'll call it 1 by 1. If this is 1 unit, you can see that there is another. When Leonardo da Vinci drew this, his mentor was 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. Leonardo had a teacher, and he was showing about the mathematics of the body. He was saying that if you stand vertical and put your arms out, the distance from fingertip to fingertip is called the span, let's say 1.6. And he worked out that the span is also the same as your height. And so Vitruvius was famous as an architect to say, why don't we study the components of the human anatomy and use that in our temple building? So when we look at a beautiful building, we're in awe because it's actually a remembrance of the divine proportion of the human body. That's where the word abode comes from, for the body, but abode is also the temple. Now, when Leonardo da Vinci drew this Vitruvian Man, I'm going to draw his circle. You can see that it goes a fraction in on the corner. Observe, it's just inside that corner there and inside this corner here. So we're drawing the circle in. And there was always a question, why didn't he lower the circle down to make the circumference of that circle equal to the square? So we're not really sure exactly what he did. And the problem here is that there is the thickness of his pencil. So when we look at the Vitruvian Man, I started to copy what he did. So there's Leonardo's circle that just goes in on the corners. And we've had about 10 famous geometers, like friends of ours and myself. We've all tried to measure the radius and what's the diameter here. So to measure the diameter of Da Vinci's drawing, we have to get a tracing paper, and when you lay it over his square, I've got the measurements, but you can see that just by the thickness of the pencil alone, there's going to be a slight error. So I'm going to bring this down to here. So what's happening is I'm bringing this blue circle of Leonardo da Vinci down to this level. Now what that means is that's a shift from, so this blue circle, Leonardo's circle, the center is the navel. That's the seat of all emotion. That's where we store all our emotions here. But what we want to do is we want to measure this. We want to measure that diameter, and we want to bring it down to the center of the groin, because the groin is the center of this square. So that's the center of the square. Now what this means is that when we stand in a square like this, my fingertips are touching the square. You can see Leonardo's fingers touching the square. But when I go from the square to an X shape like that, we notice that the arms that are raised are touching exactly the intersection of where the circle. You can see that Leonardo's hands now and feet here, I'll put them in points. These 4 points are exactly on the circle. So it's saying that man exists between the terrestrial square and the celestial circle. The circle is always the symbol of spirit. So when we bring it down and we measure it, I'm gonna take exactly this blue circle. I'm gonna do it again, and it's centered around the groin now. It's still the same one that Leonardo had. And now we can measure it. The diameter of this white circle now is called 1.272, which is called root phi. It's called root phi, and that's according to the square being 1. So that means only the subharmonics of the golden mean can create the perfected man. But we aren't perfected. While we're on this earth plane, we are in disharmonic lifestyle. We're all seeking the ideal, the heavenly plane. So what happens is that when I use this grid here to measure it, I got a calculation of the square. The perimeter of the square was 200. The length of this square is, say, 232. Oh no, the length of the square is 186 millimeters, and that the diameter that rectifies the square, these are equal perimeters. The square is equal to the circle. So that long diameter is 232. So I'm going to divide 232 by this edge length of 186, and I get 1.25. But the golden root is 1.27. So you can see that when we measure what Leonardo da Vinci did here, the distance from there to there is 1.25, whereas the ideal, the heavenly perfected mathematics, is 1.272. So we're just under that. So I'm going to draw what we think Leonardo da Vinci did. I'm going to do it in another color here. So where this white is, I'm going to draw another circle. So you can see that Leonardo da Vinci's drawing, allowing for the thickness of the pen, creates a third circle that is just inside the ideal golden root. So this is an examination of our connection to a greater picture, to a perfected state. And that's why when we look at nature, when we look at things like the flowers, the 5-petaled flowers that form a pentagon, when you look at nature very closely, it's almost perfect. It's just a fraction off. And that makes sense because people say, oh, this is not golden ratio because it's a little bit out. Just like Leonardo's diameter here is 1.25 versus the ideal of 1.272. It's so close. And I think that's to be expected. And when we do all these measurements of the man standing in a circle and woman, you need to do it over 1,000 people to get an average. So this is only an average. So just recognize that this inquiry into the human canon, to the anthropic study of how human parts form measurements like the cubit, is part of our cellular memory. It's fascinated mathematicians, and this belongs to the realms of ancient knowledge. And what we can even see is that there's a pyramid. So from the square base, to raise our energy, we have to go to this circle here. So when we discover that the pyramid angle here of 51 degrees is embedded in the human canon, we realize that our job is to take this energy from the kundalini, from the earth plane, and raise it to a higher center, to the apex of the pyramid, because we're all connected in this unity consciousness, exemplified by the Vitruvian Man. I have an amazing lesson today, which is based on the mystical quadrature of the circle. And most people know that when we make the circle equal to the square, they assume we're talking about the square area. So this is called the squaring of the circle. But I want to make this very important distinction that squaring of the circle, where if this is the unit square, if this distance along here is 1, and that means this is 1, we know that the square area of the square is just 1 times 1 is 1 square unit. So we know that that's 1 square unit. And also, when we make, how do we make this? If we pick this up like a shoestring, 1 times 1, if this, we know that we want to find the area of a circle that also is 1 unit, and we want to calculate the radius. We don't know that yet. I'll come to that. But the important distinction, and this is leading up to the magic of the Vitruvian Man, Leonardo da Vinci's code, is that there's another thing called the rectification of the square, which means we're not interested in the square area, we're interested in the perimeter and circumference relationship. This is the harmonics of the circle-square relationship. So now, if this was 1, you can see that's the same square. If this is 1, the perimeter of this square is 1, 2, 3, 4. So now we've got the perimeter of the square equals 4. And we want to make the perimeter of the square, if this was like a shoelace, you could pick this up like a string and you'd wrap it around into a circle. And I want you to appreciate that the circle of 4 units that goes around is different here. So when we squared the circle here, this circle here is exactly this size. We're going to calculate the radius. But just want you to observe that when I put this lid over here, this circle is a bit larger. So what I want you to appreciate is that the radius of this circle, 0.636, is different than the radius of the area circle squared. So you can see that the board's divided into 2 things. One's the squaring of the circle. One's the rectification of the square. Perimeters, circumference, areas. Now let's just look at this one here. We know that the area of this equals 1. The area of the square equals 1 unit. And we want to make the area of the circle, we need to calculate that. So we know, I'll write it up here, we know that pi r squared, the area of a circle, must equal 1. That's our statement. But we want to calculate the radius, you see. So I'm going to say that I'm going to divide both sides by pi because I want to get r squared on its own. So r squared equals 1 divided by pi. So I've got rid of that pi. But we don't want r squared. We just want 1r, which means we take the square root of both sides. So r equals the square root of 1 on pi. And that has a value called 0.563. So that's how I calculated 0.563. Now, I just want to let you know, for thousands of years, there's been a movement to suppress this knowledge of the squaring of the circle, because this is how we make heaven and earth meet. When we make the area of the circle, which is the heavenly energy, and the square is the earth, we're mathematically, symbolically making heaven and earth equal. But in this particular example, we'll call this harmonic 563, there is no example of phi that doesn't utilize the golden ratio. So everyone for the last 50 years have been talking about the squaring of the circle, but it does not contain the golden relationship. So I just wanted to show you that this is sacred, it's important. But now I want to move to the rectification of the square, and this is my word for it. We could call this anything, but it's all about making the perimeter of the square 1, 2, 3, 4 to equal to the circumference of the circle. So at school you learned that the circumference equals pi times diameter. But we know that the diameter is 2 lots of radii. So if the diameter goes from here to there, we know that C equals 2 pi r, because the diameter is the 2r bit. So we've got this equation now where we know now that the circumference of the circle equals 4, because it's 1, 2, 3, 4. This is picking up the string, the 4 units, and turning it into a circle. So now we can equate them. These are an equality. But we want to know the radius. So how do we get, to know the radius, I'll have to divide both sides by 2 pi. So now I've got so these cancel out. So now I know that the radius equals 2. The 2 goes into 4 twice. So the radius equals 2 over pi. So now if you get your calculator, 2 divided by 3.144. So we're using the true value of pi here, because if you use traditional pi, deficient pi, archaic pi, you're not going to get the harmonics of the golden ratio. So this radius distance here is called 0.636. And that's incredible, because now what's the diameter? So if you double 0.636, we're going to get the diameter equals 2 lots of the radius, and you're going to get this critical value called 2.72. And why is one? So the diameter of this circle that makes heaven and earth equal, where the celestial meets the terrestrial, is the subharmonic of the golden ratio, because 1.272 times itself, if you square, that's called the square root of phi. So the square root of phi, when you square it equals the golden ratio, 1.618. So this whole equation is ringing a bell, and it's ringing the golden ratio. And the reason why that's sacred is because I want you to observe what Leonardo da Vinci took this square of the circle, the squaring of the circle, and he encoded the human canon inside. So you notice that when you stand inside the square, if you just look at the square and you put your arms out, the human body fits inside the square. So the distance from the fingertip to the fingertip is called the span. So your open arms span is the same as your vertical height. But observe, this is why there's an X. If you look at the legs here, where they're spread out like the X shape, but when we spread our legs out and move our arms higher, we don't touch the square. He starts touching the circle. So the critical thing is to observe that now he touches the circle. So the human canon, the proportions of the human body fit inside a square circle relationship. And this is critical. So, and this is based on the fact that the circle has a golden root diameter. So we're stating very clearly here, and this is an important epiphany, we're stating that the Leonardo da Vinci code is based on the rectification of the square, equal perimeters, not the squaring of the circle, equal areas. So we could counter argue with that and say that the Vitruvian Man fits in this. So what I wanted to show you was what we need to do. There's more research to come. This square and circle meet down the base here. Whereas if you look over here, the square and the circle are separated. So if we were to take this unit square and slide it up a little bit, is this the rectification of the circle square? Is this about equal perimeters, this one, or is it about equal areas? So I just wanted to let you know that when we talk about the rectification of the square, see how it's got a small corner here? Just so you understand that this has got the small corners, whereas when we're talking about the squaring of the circle, can you see that we're talking about larger corners? So if you were to see this diagram, you understand now that there's 2 parts to it, because this is all about fine-tuning detail and harmonics. As we're moving into another frequency, higher consciousness, we have to start understanding what's the difference between harmonic 563 and harmonic 636. These are part of the engineering and construction of our own body parts. That's why Leonardo da Vinci's work is sacred, because he recognized that this was a fine-tuning of our consciousness. It's all part of our ascension process, how we square the circle, how we make heaven and earth meet. The celestial meets the terrestrial. Thank you. In part 1, we looked at the Vitruvian Man, the fascination with the geometry of the human body. This was drawn by Leonardo da Vinci around 1509, and we're looking at how the approximation to the golden root is encoded in the circle that's around the Vitruvian Man. So I just wanted to give you a little bit more knowledge via a PowerPoint presentation. So this image of the Vitruvian Man is in the mass consciousness. It's a classic, just like the Mona Lisa. And just to distinguish, we're going to be exploring what we call equal perimeters, which is on the right there. The harmonic is 0.636 radius. That's where the perimeter of the square equals the circumference of the circle, in contrast to the other diagram where we have larger corners, where the radius is 0.563, harmonic 563. So we're interested in the diagram with the small corners. It's called the rectification of the square, and this is the one that has the golden root diameter. This is about the perfected or ideal state of the human proportion. So Vitruvius was a very interesting man. He was actually a Roman architect and engineer at the time of Jesus. So he was 2,000 years ago. So when Leonardo da Vinci was putting a book together for Pacioli on the divine proportion, he was using this ancient knowledge of Vitruvius, this great architect. And he talked about that a temple, the windows were the eyes and the column was the spine. So we have great respect for Vitruvius in his work entitled De Architectura. And you can see that he was famous for the design of the Pantheon, and you can see the image of an 18th century painting by Panini. And on the left we see Vitruvius instructing others around him, and that's in a painting in 1684. So you can see that here we have a great master that inspired Leonardo da Vinci. And I just want to read something from his main book, in book 3, chapter 1, paragraph 2. I just want to explain how we fit inside the square, because this is what the Vitruvian Man is all about, how when we put our arms out, it's the same as our height. So I'll just read what he wrote. Just so the parts of temples should correspond with each other and with the whole, the navel is naturally placed in the center of the human body. And if in a man lying with his face upward and his hands and feet extended from his navel as the center, a circle be described, it will touch his fingers and toes. It is not alone by a circle that the human body is thus circumscribed, as may be seen by placing it within a square. For measuring from the feet to the crown of the head and then across the arms fully extended, we find the latter measure equal to the former, so that lines at right angles to each other enclosing the figure will form a square. So this is what inspired Leonardo, that we are essentially the symmetry of the square, and by extension we turn around and we fit inside of a cube. So this means we're a fractal of the universe as a whole. So this is the most special drawing, and it's just to show that all the dimensions of this is ancient knowledge, where the perimeter of the square is equal to the circumference of the circle, known as the rectification of the square. So this is a tribute to Leonardo, who drew this, and he actually drew his face in there. So this is Leonardo's kind of self-portrait, and he also wrote in the mirror imaging, in the writing below, how the body dimensions are subdivided into 14 proportions as well. So this was the author, Luca Pacioli, who wrote the book Do Divina Proportion, and he commissioned Leonardo da Vinci to actually do the drawing. So thus we have this drawing, and we can see here that there is a circle that actually touches the base of the square. So the question is, why did not Leonardo draw the perfected circle going around the corners of the square, which is called the rectification of the square? But for some reason he put the human body inside the square and inside the circle, but they were tangent and they were touching each other. So what we're going to do is we're going to shift the circle that is an approximate diameter to the golden root. We're going to bring it down from the navel to another center, the center of the square, which is the groin. And we're going to analyze these proportions. So this is about, we're an application of different energy centers and how we're going to raise this. So I started off with some tracing paper and allowing just for the thickness of a pencil, you can see that there's going to be a slight error. And we already know that all the pyramid angles are encoded in this. So when I measure this in millimeters, according to my tracing paper, we have the square edge is 186 millimeters and the diameter of the circle that rectifies the square is 232. So as a division, it's 1.25, and it's just a fraction less than the ideal called 1.27, which is the golden root. So this explains why we're on the terrestrial plane on this earthly life. Everything is just a little bit less than the ideal, than the heavenly plane. So as we look at the pentagonal arrangement of petals, we see that it's very close to a pentagon. When you look at the green leaves here, it's 5-pointed star, but just a fraction out. And this is the intention, that we haven't reached the ideal state. To reach the ideal state, we need to take the base. We need to take the base of the pyramid, which is the midpoint of the square, going through the center of the square. You can see that it touches the square, but when you look at the apex, there's a shift of energy going to the top of the circle. The circle is the celestial, the spirit realm. So the mathematics of the pyramid, the 51-degree, 51-minute angle in the pyramid, is ancient knowledge. It's telling us to raise the energy from the kundalini, from the root chakra, up to the next level, the navel, which is the seat of all emotions. And when we tame our emotions, we are in what we call the process of an ascension journey. And here we can see that other great mathematicians like Scott Onstott, someone who I revere very much, he has already shown that when you take the Vitruvian Man circle square complex and actually put it inside the Giseh pyramid, where the extended arms touch the corner of his square, that line on the pyramid subdivides the slope of the pyramid into the golden rectangle phi harmonics. So this is new insight, and this is why we love teaching, because we're about sharing knowledge, and this is all ancient knowledge. But say Scott Onstott here has contributed some fantastic new revelations. So that's why the mathematics of the Great Pyramid goes from the earthly plane to the spiritual, but it also encompasses the mathematics of the earth joined with the radius of the moon. We actually are the mystical squaring or the quadrature of the circle. We have all this knowledge in our cellular memory. That's why it's great to examine the pyramid ratio. And we can see here that man, woman are in a perfected anatomical ratio. We're perfected as we are, but we're just a fraction less than the ideal. And that's why the pyramid maths is a reminder with the Vitruvian Man that we are a fractal of the whole cosmology. So I just wanted to let you know that we are in a state in nature where we learn and we copy from nature, but nature will never actually get to the ideal, the golden root, 1.272. So the Vitruvian Man is showing us that we are here to join the terrestrial energy, to raise our frequency up from the heart to the higher heart.